Between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago, sea levels were significantly lower across the Taiwan Strait. This allowed settlers greater ability to cross the strait to reach the island. But as the sea levels rose, the people of the island became more isolated from the mainland. Austrasian languages, a language family later found across Southeast Asia, Polynesia, and Madagascar, became dominant among the island's indigenous people. These languages are distinct and different from languages that came to dominate much of China, and many scholars have argued that in fact Taiwan was the source of this language family. Around 5,000 years ago, it's believed that some farmers from the southeast coast of what is now China were able to cross the strait more easily, leading to interactions and greater trade with the people living on the island. But most accounts make clear that the new settlers were a relatively small group compared to the native peoples of the island, and those native people were a distinct culture with distinct languages. As various Chinese empires rose and fell throughout the years, it doesn't appear that anyone took a claim over the island. In fact, there was little documentation of any formal contact with the island. In 1292, during the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, a delegation intended to be sent to the Ryukyu kingdom accidentally ended up landing on Taiwan. After 3 soldiers were killed, they were forced to retreat back to the mainland. In 1349, Chinese explorer Wang Juan visited the island, saying, quote, "Overseas countries start from here." He claimed that while there were some Chinese settlers living on the nearby Penghu Islands, he had found none on the Taiwanese mainland. On that mainland, he described a people as having, quote, "hair tied in tufts, bodies tattooed with black juice, heads wrapped in red silk and yellow cloth." He said they made liquor from fermented sugar cane and boiled seawater to harvest salt. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, trade between the mainland and Taiwan had grown significantly enough that many merchants were learning the Formosan language to be able to facilitate trade. In the early days, Chinese merchants sold things like iron and textiles in exchange for things like coal, sulfur, gold, and venison. Over time, mullet fishing also became a major export of the island. But just as importantly, the island was also used covertly as an intermediary to circumvent restrictions on trade between Japan and China. This trade was so substantial that in 1593, the trade became licensed by the empire, basically acknowledging what had been previously an illegal trade route. As early as 1542, Portuguese sailors had named the island Formosa, which translated in Portuguese as Beautiful Island. But aside from a shipwreck in 1582, there was almost no attempt by any Europeans to create any type of settlement on the island. The Portuguese did negotiate a lease from Chinese to set up a trading port in the Macau Peninsula, acquiring a great deal of wealth by themselves acting as intermediaries between Japan and China. Direct trade had been banned due to ongoing raids from Japanese pirates. By the early 1600s, the Dutch were looking to get involved in these trade operations. But the Dutch East India Company's base of operations was in Batavia, in what is now Jakarta, Indonesia. This left them poorly positioned geographically and politically with regards to China. In 1604, the Dutch sent an expedition to attack Macau, but the ships were forced off the coastline of Taiwan due to a typhoon, and eventually forced to retreat entirely by Chinese naval forces. In 1622, the Dutch sent another invasion force, consisting of 13 ships and around 1,300 crew, to try to capture the Portuguese trading port of Macau, but once again they were unsuccessful. The Dutch were able to set up a base of operations at what is now modern-day Making in the Pescadores, islands off the coast of Taiwan, building a fort using forced Chinese labor. But the conditions were so poor for these workers that reportedly 1,300 of the 1,500 conscripted died during the construction. From this fort, the Dutch were able to threaten the region with attacks on ports and general piracy if the Dutch East India Company was not given access to trade by the Chinese. But by 1624, the Chinese had had enough of the threats and raids and surrounded the Dutch fort. At this point, the Dutch were forced to sue for peace and withdraw from the Pescadores to mainland Taiwan, which was then referred to as Formosa. The Chinese reportedly called the Dutch red-haired barbarians and took some of the prisoners from the conflict before the emperor as part of the victory celebration. Southwest Formosa had a group of around 1,500 largely Chinese people living in the area, although they often split time between the island and the mainland. By around 1626, the Dutch had finalized Fort Zeelandia in what is now the Anping district of Taiwan. The fort was occupied by a few hundred soldiers and artillery specialists, who were described by a Portuguese sailor as, quote, "short, miserable, and very dirty." Sailing in this area was often treacherous. In 1622, and again in 1634, Dutch ships found themselves shipwrecked on reefs near the Luchu Islands and were reportedly killed by native people on those islands. The Dutch governor gave out an order to send an expedition to the island to, quote, punish and exterminate the people of the Golden Lion Island as an example for their murderous actions committed against our people. In 1633, an expedition found evidence of the lost ships and crew, as well as locating a cave where they believed the native people would retreat to in times of distress. Using this information in 1636, a larger expedition was sent to the island that blocked all the entrances of the cave where the local population was hiding, and set fires using pitch and sulfur to fill the caves with poisonous fumes over a period of 8 days. They reportedly heard the desperate cries of those trapped inside the cave throughout this process. Once the caves were open and the fumes cleared, roughly 300 corpses of men, women, and children who had been suffocated by the fumes were found inside. Those not in the cave were captured, with the men enslaved, and the women and children either sold into servitude or forced to marry Dutchmen. On the main island of Formosa, the Dutch initially traded with the local villages for things like firewood, venison, and fish, but over time, these relations soured. The native people of Formosa had hoped the Dutch would help provide protection from regional pirates, but now they found the Dutch were themselves a threat, and they resented that they were now being asked to pay both the Dutch and Chinese for protection from pirates. As the Dutch forces on the island grew, much of the resistance from the native villages was pacified, often by force, but this didn't mean that the residents of the island were always friendly. An example being what happened to a Dutch missionary, the account of which read, quote, the catechist, Daniel Hendricks, whose name has been often mentioned, accompanied this expedition to the south, as his great knowledge of the Formosa language and familiar intercourse with the natives rendered his services very valuable. On reaching the island of Pengsu, he ventured, perhaps with overweening confidence in himself, too far away from the others, and was suddenly surrounded by a great number of armed natives, who, after killing him, carried away in triumph his head, arms, legs, and other members, even his entrails, leaving the mutilated trunk behind. The Dutch recruited settlers from mainland China, but these settlers were also attacked by the native people as they encroached on the settlements, as the Dutch granted lands to the Chinese settlers in limited areas. But native groups were also in conflict with each other, leading to shifted alliances between all of the various parties. Additionally, the Dutch were not the only European power on the island. Also in 1626, the Spanish, seeing the Dutch colony in the south as a threat to their colony in the Philippines, landed at Cape Santiago and found a better harbor in the west to what is now Quezon City, building a series of forts. In 1641, the Dutch governor sent a letter indicating their intents to remove the Spanish by force, writing, quote, Sir, I have the honor to communicate to you that I have received the command of a considerable naval and military force, with the view of making you master by civil means of otherwise the fortress of Santa Trinidad on the island of Cayulang, which your excellency is the governor. In accordance with the uses of Christian nations to make known their intentions for commencing hostilities, I now summon your excellency to surrender. In response, the Spanish governor wrote, quote, Sir, I have duly received your communication of the 28th of August, and in response, I have the honor to point out to you that as it becomes a good Christian who recalls the oath he has made before his king, I cannot and will not surrender the forts demanded by your excellency, as I and my garrison have determined to defend them. I am accustomed to find myself before the great armies, and I have engaged in numerous battles in Flanders, as well as other countries, and so I beg of you to not take the trouble of writing me further letters of like tenor. May each one defend himself as best he can. We are Spanish Christians, and God, in whom we trust, is our protector. May the Lord have mercy on you. The Dutch attack was unsuccessful in removing the Spanish, but it did great damage to the native people near the Spanish fort, whom the Spanish had promised to protect. The leader of the Spanish fort complained that after the attack by the Dutch, they could no longer convince the native people to work with the Spanish, writing, quote, They are traitors and risen against us, being of a nature that they only help those who vanquish them. A year later, in 1642, while the Spanish had withdrawn some of their forces in the area to protect an expedition in the Philippines, the Dutch took advantage and captured the settlement, functionally ending Spanish Formosa. In 1644, civil war broke out on the Chinese mainland, disrupting the silk trade which the Dutch colonies depended on. Needing to find alternative revenue, the Dutch increased taxes on the Chinese settlers that they had brought to the island. But this led to a Chinese settler uprising against the Dutch in 1652. Some of the native villagers joined, opposing ongoing demands from the Dutch, and beheaded 2 Dutch translators. But many native warriors saw the Chinese settlers just as much as invaders to the island as the Dutch, and saw more profit in aiding the Dutch. Collectively, the Dutch and native mercenaries were able to put down the uprising, killing its leader and placing his head on a spike. An estimated 4,000 Chinese settlers were killed, which was approximately 10% of the total Chinese living on the island at the time. And in the years that followed, trade with China was restricted even further. Crops on the island were beset by locusts, and native people suffered from outbreaks of plague. All of these factors further weakened the Dutch colony. As the Chinese Civil War progressed, the son of a wealthy Chinese merchant and a Japanese woman named Zhang Chegong was leading Ming military forces against Manchu invaders. In early 1646, the Ming emperor had been captured and executed, leaving the Ming military with an army but no emperor. Zhang Chegong's father surrendered to Qing forces in 1646, but he and his uncles continued to resist. They recruited forces to conduct raids on Qing forces throughout the area, but eventually Qing forces reached his family home, where reportedly his Japanese mother committed suicide rather than allow herself to be captured. While he was unable to control much territory on the Chinese mainland, or even fully blockade and siege cities with access to land to resupply, he was able to build a very strong naval force. And while he couldn't take mainland China, Formosa was another matter. In March of 1661, he led a force of approximately 25,000 men against the Dutch. The Dutch reportedly said that he said to them, quote, "Hitherto this island had always belonged to China, and the Dutch had doubtless been permitted to live there, seeing that the Chinese did not require it for themselves. But requiring it now, it was only fair that Dutch strangers, who came from far regions, should give way to the masters of the island." The Dutch did not give up without a fight, with the siege of Fort Zeelandia lasting nearly a year, but many of the native people of the island turned against the Dutch, and large numbers of people on both sides ended up being taken prisoner. Both sides claim atrocities against these prisoners. At least one Dutch physician reportedly performed a vivisection on a Chinese prisoner, while according to Dutch accounts, the Chinese amputated the genitals, noses, ears, and limbs of Dutch prisoners while they were still alive, and then would send back the mutilated corpses with the mouths of Dutch soldiers filled with their amputated genitalia. The Dutch also wrote that many of the captured men were killed by crucifixion, and argued the most fortunate were the ones who only suffered decapitation. Many Dutch women and children were captured and enslaved, with Zhang Chegong taking a Dutch missionary's teenage daughter as his concubine. A Dutch journal wrote, quote, "The best were preserved for the use of the commanders, and the rest were sold for the common soldiers. Happy was the she that fell to a lot of an unmarried man, being thereby freed from the vexations by the Chinese women, who were very jealous of their husbands." On January 12, 1662, with the supplies nearly exhausted, the Dutch governor finally surrendered. On the 9th of February, the remaining Dutch East India Company surrendered, and all the remaining personnel left Taiwan, allowed to take with them only their personal belongings, as well as provisions sufficient for them to reach the nearest Dutch settlement. Zhang Shegong proclaimed the island was now the eastern capital of the Ming dynasty. He named the area around the fort the Kingdom of Dongning, also known as Taiwan. He planned to use the island as a base of operations to be able to reinvade and restore the Ming dynasty and destroy the Qing dynasty. His plan was to attempt to expand to take control of the Spanish Philippines, using his navy to raid a number of settlements. But at the age of 37, in 1662, he died. By 1664, many of his supporters, as well as those who supported the Ming dynasty generally, were fleeing to Taiwan. The Dutch and the Qing both attempted invasions, twice in December of 1664, both times being thwarted by bad weather. The Dutch were able to hold a port location in what is now modern-day Keelung until 1668, but that was the extent of their ability to regain control of the island. In 1669, the Qing dynasty attempted to negotiate peace with Zhang Shigong's son, Zhang Jing, offering autonomy if they would agree to shave their heads in the Manchu style, but this offer was declined. Despite sanctions, Zhang Jing was able to set up infrastructure and agricultural reforms on the island that made it largely self-sufficient, while also building shrines and educational academies. But these reforms didn't come without some resistance from native groups. Those who refused to support the reforms were punished and sometimes killed. Still, the population of the island more than doubled during his reign, mainly due to many Han Chinese leaving the mainland for Taiwan. In fact, the Taiwanese rulers continued their attempts to retake mainland China. Joining with other resistance groups still loyal to the Ming dynasty, between 1673 and 1683, the kingdom was able to capture some coastal settlements near or on the mainland. This was part of the revolt of the three feudatories. But this counteroffensive was short-lived, and after the death of Qing in 1681, his very young son took power for a few years before the massive naval battle of Penghu in 1683. This battle functionally ended the empire, and the Qing were able to force the then 13-year-old head of the Sing family to surrender. After shaving his head in the Manchu style and forcing him to swear loyalty to the Qing, he was given a Qin title over Taiwan, but not allowed to live on the island. All former Ming princes were required to live on the Chinese mainland. Prior to taking control of the island, the Qing dynasty did not believe there was much value, with some referring to it as, quote, a ball of mud beyond the pale of civilization. But one of the Chinese generals who led the conquest of the island saw it quite differently. He wrote back, quote, I have personally traveled through Taiwan and seen firsthand the fertility of its wild lands and the abundance of its natural resources. Both mulberry and field crops can be cultivated. Fish and salt spout from the sea. The mountains are filled with dense forests of tall trees and thick bamboo. There is sulfur, rattan, sugarcane, deerskins, and all that is needed for daily living. Nothing is lacking. This is truly a bountiful, fertile piece of land and a strategic territory. Other Qing officials viewed it less favorably. One wrote that the island was full of outlaws and barbarians who practiced headhunting, wore no shoes, and used grass to stain their teeth black. The Qing initially tried to restrict additional migration to Taiwan and send many native Chinese living on the island back to the mainland. But labor shortages and the desire for Han Chinese to have a place outside of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty to live led to massive illegal immigration to the island, with tens of thousands arriving annually by 1711, a year before the formal permit system gave a legal path to go. This migration eventually overwhelmed the native population, who were largely left to fend for themselves by the Qing in whatever conflict occurred, with nominal boundaries first ignored by the settlers before formally being moved by the officials over the decades that followed, although laws against marriage of the native people exist, in part to prevent marital land transfer. Starting in 1732, entire migrant families were allowed to legally enter Taiwan, but only for an 8-year period before concerns about vagrancy led the government to bar the practice again. But by 1771, it was clear that the laws were simply not enforceable, despite tens of thousands of arrests over the years. By 1811, there were more than 1 million Han Chinese settlers in Taiwan, and more settlers began to encroach on or even engage in open conflict with the native peoples over land rights, leading to a common saying being, quote, every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion. By 1831, tensions between the Qing dynasty and the British East India Company were growing into what would eventually become Opium Wars. These Opium Wars came to Taiwan in 1841 when British gunboats blockaded Keelung Harbor on 3 separate occasions. As the Qing dynasty fell into civil war during the Taiping Rebellion, Taiwan's isolation allowed it to avoid the worst of the conflict. But the weakening Qing dynasty had become more and more vulnerable to outside powers. In the 1870s, some in Imperial Japan were calling for an invasion of Taiwan as part of its ongoing expansion into the Ryukyu Islands. When native Taiwanese killed shipwrecked sailors in southern Taiwan, the Japanese used the incident as a pretext for invasion, claiming the Qing had failed to govern the island. In 1874, 4 Japanese warships and over 3,000 troops attacked in southern Taiwan, destroying native villages and establishing military camps. But over 500 of the soldiers who invaded died of illness between August and September, and an agreement with the Qing was reached to allow Japan to pay the Qing to annex the Ryukyu Islands, but leave the larger island of Taiwan. Following this agreement, the Imperial Commissioner of Taiwan argued, quote, the reason that Taiwan is being coveted by Japan is that the land is too empty. He called for forcing the native people into subjugation and expanding Chinese settlement both in terms of people and infrastructure on the island. During a war with France, France was able to briefly occupy Keelung in 1884, but withdrew the following year. This only increased the urgency of securing the territory, and large financial investments in the mainland were made to develop the island, including electrical infrastructure, telegraph, and railways. By 1887, around 500 native villages and 90,000 native peoples had agreed to submit to being ruled by the Qing dynasty, eventually growing to over 800 villages and nearly 150,000 people. But still many resisted, leading to more than 40 deployments with over 17,000 soldiers sent to pacify native resistance movements. This compared to the 2.5 million Chinese settlers on the now cultivated western plains of the island, which would grow to nearly 3 million by 1895, the overwhelming majority being Han Chinese. Around the same time, the Qing dynasty was at war with Japan, primarily over control of Korea. But this eventually also surrounded the question of control of Taiwan. When the Qing dynasty were defeated on the battlefield, both at sea and on land, by Japanese forces, the Japanese were able to force them to sign a treaty which relinquished control of Taiwan in perpetuity, along with a number of other concessions. But concession by the Qing emperor was not the same as acceptance from the leadership of Taiwan. The former Qing governor issued a statement claiming that Taiwan was now the independent Republic of Formosa. In it he wrote, quote, "The Japanese have affronted China by annexing our territory of Formosa, and the supplication of us, the people of Formosa, at the portals of the throne have been made in vain. We now learn that the Japanese slaves are about to arrive. If we suffer this, the land of our hearths and homes will become the land of savages and barbarians. But if we do not suffer it, our condition of comparative weakness will certainly not endure long. Frequent conferences have been held with the foreign powers, who all after the people of Formosa must establish their independence before the powers will assist them." He sought the aid of a retired commander of a paramilitary organization known as the Black Flag Army to organize a resistance army against the Japanese invaders, as they had against the French a decade prior in Vietnam. But they were unsuccessful. On May 25, 1895, the former governor declared himself president, but was forced to flee the island just over a week later. The second president, in his absence, was the leader of the Black Flag Army, who was also forced to flee on October 20th, ending the Republic after just 5 months. In places like Taipei, generally the soldiers surrendered to the Japanese without giving much of any resistance. An American war correspondent wrote, quote, "At 2 a.m. on 5 June, the yellow Republican tiger gathered in his long tail and laid down and died for lack of nourishment." But this wasn't true of the entire island. In areas where the troops were made up of locals rather than Qing soldiers who'd been brought from the mainland and seemed eager to return, this often came in the form of guerrilla warfare. The same war correspondent wrote, quote, "The greatest obstacle that the Japanese encountered was the smiling villagers who stood in their doorways, over which they had flown a white flag, watching the troops pass. For these natives, the Japanese said at first a kind word and a smile. But scarcely were the troops out of sight before guns were brought through the same doorways and shots fired at the first unfortunate party whose numbers were sufficiently small to make it appear safe to the treacherous occupants. Troops now return and find the mutilated bodies of their companions in the streets, while at the doors and the windows of the houses near are the same grinning fiends and the same little white flags, an emblem of peace, still floating over their guilty heads." The Japanese response was aggressive and brutal, but the occupation required a massive Japanese commitment of around 100,000 soldiers. The final open battle took place in November of 1885, at what the Taiwanese call the Battle of the Burning Village. This last stand was written about decades later by a Chinese scholar in a poem which translates to, "Imposing as the rivers and mountains, bright as the sun and the moon, the glorious history of our nation shines on the burning village." A large number of Chinese fled Taiwan during this time. The Japanese gave those who remained the option to either sell their property and leave by May of 1897 or become Japanese subjects. But resistance continued. On June 13, 1896, a Japanese shop was looted by local resistance forces in the Yunlin area. A small detachment of Japanese soldiers was sent to locate the resistance fighters and were ambushed. In response, a Japanese official wrote, quote, "There are no good people under Yunlin's jurisdiction." A larger Japanese force was brought to the area, and between June 20th and June 23rd, according to their own reports, they burned 4,925 homes and 56 villages in the area, killing thousands in an event known as the Yunlin Massacre. These conflicts continued for years. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed or wounded, and tens of thousands of Taiwanese citizens were killed. Another example occurred in Beipu Township, where a group of Taiwanese, both native and Chinese, attacked and killed 57 Japanese officials and their families. This led the Japanese to kill over 100 Taiwanese in retaliation. While all of this was taking place, in mainland China, there was massive famine. The Qing dynasty, already in decline, had a 2-year-old emperor placed on the throne in 1908. In 1911, the Qing dynasty was overthrown, becoming the Republic of China on January 1st, 1912. In 1915, members of a Taiwanese religious group opposed to the Japanese occupation launched a surprise attack on a number of Japanese police stations, killing police, officials, and their families across several towns. The Japanese army was able to arrest the ringleaders, but also killed hundreds of Taiwanese in retaliation. In 1930, a group of native Taiwanese resisting forced assimilation programs, attacked police stations and an elementary school, killing 134 Japanese and 2 Chinese, including children at the school. In response, the Japanese army proceeded to kill over 600 native villagers, dropping chemical weapons on villages in the area. After these attacks, an estimated 500 indigenous Taiwanese surrendered to the Japanese and were confined to a village nearby. But a few months later after their surrender, the Japanese authorities decided to attack that village and reportedly beheaded every male over the age of 15. This isn't to say all of the resistance was violent. There were nonviolent resistance movements, such as the Taiwanese Cultural Association, who advocated for Taiwanese self-governance, with the stated mission of asking the Japanese to, quote, adopt a stance of national self-determination, enacting the enlightenment of the islanders, and seeking legal extension of civil rights. But even these peaceful protests were rejected in 1923, when its leader and 99 others were arrested for petitioning for a Taiwanese parliament. Until around 1922, the approach of the Japanese colonial government had largely been to segregate Japanese and Taiwanese populations on the island. But likely as a result of the ongoing resistance movements, there was a shift into attempted assimilation programs, which became more aggressive as war broke out between Japan and China in 1937. The success of these efforts is quite debated. Some 200,000 Taiwanese did serve Japan in some capacity during World War II, and as part of the war effort, Japan instituted rapid industrialization reforms to the report that by 1939, for the first time, industrial production outpaced agricultural production on the island. Taiwan was where the Japanese army launched the invasion of Guangdong Province in 1938, and it became a major Allied target after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1942, the United States joined China in its ongoing war against Japan, and in doing so, announced it was voiding the previous agreements which had conceded Taiwan to Japan. It now viewed Taiwan as a part of China. This was formalized in 1943 as part of the Cairo Declaration, although that document was never formally signed or ratified. As part of Japan's surrender in 1945, Taiwan was understood to be no longer Japanese territory, but it wasn't until 1951 that Japan formally revoked its claim to, quote, Formosa and the Pescadores. On October 26, 1945, China declared that Taiwan was now a province of China, effectively giving control to the head of the Chinese nationalist government at the time, Chiang Kai-shek. It's believed that most of the 300,000 Japanese who were living on the island at that time were expelled soon after Japan's surrender. But the people who remained on the island were not entirely accepting of the new Chinese rulers. The Chinese leaders confiscated some 500 previously owned Chinese factories and businesses, which was seen as theft by many on the island. On top of this, economic mismanagement led to massive inflation and food shortages, leading to a resentment of mainland Chinese rule. Because of this mismanagement, massive black markets emerged to meet demand. Mainland China also found itself in the midst of a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces and Mao Zedong's communist forces. On February 28, 1947, Chinese officials confiscated black market cigarettes from a widow in Taipei. When she demanded they were to be returned to her, she was struck in the head with the butt of a rifle. All of this was done in front of a rather large crowd, who surrounded the enforcement officers. One of the officers fired into the crowd, killing a man. The next morning, large crowds of protesters emerged, calling for the agents involved to be put on trial. Officials fired on the crowd, killing 3 more people. By March 4th, the protesters had taken control of the local military facilities as well as local radio stations, where they called for an open revolt. Reportedly, over 1,000 mainland Chinese were targeted and killed by those involved in the protest over the next few weeks. A brutal crackdown followed. The New York Times reported, quote, an American who just arrived in China from Taipei said that troops in the mainland China arrived there on March 7th and indulged in 3 days of indiscriminate killing and arrest. For a time, everyone seen on the streets was fired upon. Homes were broken into, and occupants were arrested. In the lower income sections, the streets were said to have been littered with dead. Estimates vary, but most agree between 4,000 and 28,000 Taiwanese were killed in this crackdown. As the Civil War progressed, Mao Zedong's communist forces were able to take control of mainland China, and roughly 2 million people fled with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. This added to an island which had less than 7 million people prior. Chiang Kai-shek then declared that he was moving the capital to Taipei. Chiang Kai-shek stated the retreat to Taiwan was a temporary one. He said, quote, prepare for 1 year, counterattack in 2 years, sweep out the enemy in 3 years, and succeed within 5 years. But this did not occur. Mao, now in control of mainland China, established the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. Rather than attempt to invade Taiwan, which would have been a nearly impossible task given the United States having a large naval fleet nearby which would intercept any attempted naval crossing, the People's Republic of China turned its attention to the Korean War and internal land reform programs, rather than attempting to continue the fight and attack the highly defensible island of Taiwan, despite Chiang Kai-shek fleeing there. With regards to the land reform, more than 300 million people who had been previously landless were given portions of around 47 million hectares of land. This did not come without a cost. The Director of Public Security Minister wrote that, quote, 712,000 counter-revolutionaries were executed, 1.29 million were imprisoned, and 1.2 million were subject to control at various times. Most believe these were conservative estimates by the Chinese government, with many putting the numbers at over 2 million people. During this same time, Taiwanese policy was quite different, greatly benefiting from outside assistance. Following the outbreak of the Korean War, as part of efforts based around the logic of domino theory, from 1950 to 1965, the United States sent $1.5 billion in economic aid and $2.4 billion in military aid to Taiwan. This funding was used on massive infrastructure projects all over the island. On mainland China, the People's Republic of China, from 1959 to 1961, were also engaging in ongoing land reforms to create what were known as people's communes. But gross mismanagement by central authorities led to massive famine. Estimates range between 15 million and 55 million people died of starvation and malnutrition caused by food shortages. A Chinese journalist would later write of the event, quote, in Yinyang, people starved at the doors of grain warehouses. As they died, they shouted, Communist Party, Chairman Mao, save us. If the granaries of Henan and Hebei had been opened, no one need have died. As people were dying in large numbers around them, officials did not think to save them. Their only concern was how to fulfill the delivery of grain. Laborers who had previously worked to harvest were allocated to industrial projects, leaving crops to rot in the field. And even those who harvested were misallocated as China was a net international exporter of grain at a time when its people were starving in massive numbers. In some provinces, more than 10% of the total population died of famine-related causes. Although Taiwan avoided famine, it was still functionally in a dictatorship ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, largely operating under martial law, with political opposition highly repressed and only one party allowed to rule. Chiang Kai-shek was quoted as saying, I would rather mistakenly kill 1,000 innocent people than allow one communist to escape. In the brutal crackdowns, estimates are around 140,000 people were jailed, many of them tortured. Estimates are between 3,000 and 4,000 were executed between 1949 and 1987. Taiwan also instituted land reform programs, most notably the 37.5% Arable Rate Reduction Act, which capped landlord rent at 37.5% of crop yield, assuring most of the profit would go to the person working the land. Prior to the law, average rent was around 50% of crop yield, with no allowances for poor harvests caused by natural disasters such as drought or flooding. This was followed in 1951 by a Public Land Distribution Act, which gave nearly 140,000 hectares of land to around 280,000 people, previously tenant farming households. As a result of these and other reforms, between 1949 and 1960, rice yields increased by 50% per hectare, with individual farmers' net income tripling, allowing around 80% of the Taiwanese farmers to become landowners. Although most Western powers nominally argued that Taiwan was the rightful successor to China, despite the fact that the People's Republic of China had won the war, reality was reality. Learning from the mistakes of the Great Leap Forward, China had once again grown into a major world power, far larger and more powerful than Taiwan. Although Taiwan's reforms had led to massive growth to the point that its GDP per capita was 4 times larger than China, China's population was 48 times that of Taiwan. In 1971, in an effort to reach a compromise, the UN offered dual representation, one from Beijing and one from Taipei. Chiang Kai-shek responded with a speech declaring, quote, the sky is not big enough for 2 suns. And as a result, the, quote, representatives of Chiang Kai-shek were removed from the UN, leaving only the People's Republic of China. In 1972, American President Nixon, a staunch anti-communist, went to China, ending 25 years of isolation. This made it very clear that the diplomatic position stating that Taiwan was China was more performative than practical. When Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, there was some loosening control, but only minimally. The first opposition party was not allowed until 1986. Martial law, which had been in place for almost 40 years, wasn't lifted until 1987. Taiwan's first democratic presidential election occurred in 1996. In an effort to intimidate voters into selecting a candidate viewed as pro-unification, China fired missiles across the strait. In response, the United States deployed 2 aircraft carriers to the region to support Taiwan. It wasn't until 2000 that the first candidate not connected to Chiang Kai-shek's ruling party was able to take power. In August of 2002, he gave a speech where he declared, quote, "With Taiwan and China on each side of the Taiwan Strait, each side is a country." But the People's Republic of China did not agree. In 2005, an anti-secession law was passed stating, quote, "There is only one China in the world. The mainland and Taiwan belong to one China. China's sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be divided. Maintaining national sovereignty and territorial integrity is the common obligation of all Chinese people, including our compatriots in Taiwan." The law went on to say that China could take, quote, "non-peaceful means and other necessary measures to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity should Taiwan declare independence formally." History is awkward.